Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CAQH webinar, DirectAssure, Improving Provider Directory Accuracy. My name is Karen Waller. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications and will be the moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to review some housekeeping details for all those listening in today. Today's session is being recorded. You will receive an email tomorrow that will have a link to the on-demand webinar that you can share with others in your organization. You can also get a recording of the presentation from your account manager. The phones will be muted throughout the webinar today. Please submit all questions online. You can ask the question at any time during the session. Simply type your question into the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar panel on your screen, and we'll answer your questions at the end of today's presentation. So now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. They are Hassan Sohal, who is Product Manager at CAQH, and also Ron Irwong, Senior Product Manager at CAQH. Both of them are quite familiar with DirectAssure and are working to make the solution even more robust to improve your plan's provider directories. So I'd like to turn it over to Ron.
Thanks, Karen. So we'll take a look at the agenda today before we dig into all of the content. I know that most of the attendees here are at least somewhat familiar with the DirectAssure solution, but we'll take the first few minutes to just recap the industry problems we're trying to solve with the solution and how it works. And then I'll hand it off to my colleague, Hassan, who will be going into the details around the new enhancements that were recently released late last year. Okay, so let's proceed to slide 5. So just a recap of the industry problems. As many of you are familiar, there are a number of regulatory requirements around provider directory. Your health plans have been having to deal with these for the past 2 years, ever since January of 2016, from CMS, from state regulators, as well as accreditation requirements. But in addition to that, if we dig deeper into kind of the root causes of these problems and what you're experiencing on your side, on the health plan side, you guys have had to deal with reaching out to a number of providers and through multiple channels and trying to get their information. On the provider side, of course, they are experiencing the burden of having to communicate information to multiple health plans through a disparate number of channels. It's from the provider perspective, it is quite redundant, and they can feel like they are having to provide the same information multiple times. On the health plan side, you guys are having to consume this information from providers in multiple channels, and a lot of times it's not presented in the best format or of sufficient quality, or not actionable enough for you to be able to process quickly, which is important relative to the regulatory requirements. Many regulatory requirements are imposing timelines for health plans to update their directories within 30 days. And then finally, there are concerns about the integrity or the quality of the data that's being delivered to the health plans. So let's move on to the next slide. I wanted to provide an overview of the baseline solution of DirectAssure. It's serving as a one-stop shop for providers to enter their directory information once and make it available to all health plans. On the outreach side, we're reducing the amount of outreach health plans have to perform to providers and the amount of outreach that providers are receiving from health plans. So reducing a lot of the industry abrasion around the communications there as well. In addition to that, as we are reducing the outreach and rationalizing the number of channels where health plans are receiving information and providers have to submit it, providers are experiencing a more streamlined experience where they're not having to perform a lot of redundant activities. Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into how the solution works. From the provider's perspective, this is just a small enhancement on their experience within ProView. Over 1 million providers are used to coming into the system every 120 days to review, update, and attest to their information. The DirectAssure solution simply captures a subset of information within the profile that's relevant to directories, presents it to them in a user-friendly fashion, allows them to quickly review it within a matter of seconds, also giving them the opportunity to update if there are any errors within the data, and then allow them to go through that familiar process of attesting and confirming that all the information is correct. And then plans, after the attestation has been executed, will be able to receive the directory updates via extracts that they are familiar with consuming through other processes as well. Okay. And then let's dig a little bit deeper into how the provider outreach works. So as many of you are familiar, relative to the Medicare Advantage requirements, health plans are required to outreach to all network providers who are published in their directories once a quarter. So what we do within the DirectAssure solution is we take the health plan requests for outreach and we rationalize them so that we're only reaching out to the provider once on behalf of all health plans every quarter. So this reduces the number of outreaches and it gives the provider a single communication and a single link that they can use to go into ProView and update their information. We perform email outreach primarily. This provides them with very easy to understand instructions on how to go into the system and review their information. Phone outreach is reserved as an option if the providers do not respond promptly to the email outreach. And so non-responsive providers are entered into a queue for our outbound call team to encourage them to come into the system, review their information, and make it available to health plans. The vast majority of providers are responding either to the email outreach or even without the email outreach. Most of them are coming into the system just as a matter of course. So that covers how the solution has worked up until around October of last year. In October, we released some new enhancements, which I'd like to pass it along to my colleague Hassan to review.
Thanks, Ron. So after we released our solution, we heard that some of the health plans that were using our solution still had some questions that they wanted answered to keep their directories more accurate. Some of these questions are on the screen, and you may be able to relate to them. Most importantly, folks were asking us, well, we have locations in our directories that CAQH's ProView or DirectAssure doesn't provide. What do we do with those locations? There are always questions about, does a provider know that are they aware that they're in our network, and are they accepting new patients? And then, of course, customers wanted to know, what are the best strategies that they can use to remove locations that might be incorrect? And then finally, after we released DirectAssure, we know that some clients had some trouble implementing a solution at their organization. This is a difficult space at most health plan organizations. Traditionally, most health plans aren't used to looking at data from the mindset of provider directory. So this was new for the industry. So I want to talk about really those 4 areas moving forward and what we've really done to address some of the problems, especially around practice locations being inaccurate. So let's go to the next slide. Some of you guys may be familiar with this slide. This is a list of errors following the CMS audit in late 2016, and they released these results in early 2017. As you can see, most of the errors are related to the provider not practicing at location. And then some of the following errors are a subset of that, where the address is either incorrect or the provider isn't practicing at those locations. So what we really wanted to do to address some of these new challenges is focus in on those particular type of errors where we think we can make the most gains in directory accuracy. Next slide, please. So starting on October 30th, we released some critical new features. I'm going to give a quick overview, and then we're going to dive deep into each one of those. So practice location reconciliation. We think one of the ideas we were brainstorming was most of the time, the providers don't really know what information health plans have on their directories. So we created this solution where health plans can submit their directory data to DirectAssure. We will compare it with the data that we already have for that provider in our system in ProView. And any differences where the health plan has data that ProView does not have data, we will ask the providers to reconcile those differences. Now, we've implemented a couple of key benefits to execute this task: address standardization and duplicate address checking to make sure that the provider is responding to a standardized USPS address and they're not looking at the same address multiple times if it's spelled differently in various health plan directories. That's a really key feature we think that is going to really improve the accuracy of health plan locations and really give a quick boost for some of the plans that haven't really cleaned up their directories in the past few years. Moving on, practice affiliation responses. Now, we know that oftentimes providers correctly affiliate themselves with an address. However, they may not be taking appointments there, so it's not really relevant to publish that address in a directory. We have included more detail on our portal to ask providers to tell us their affiliation about specific locations so that our health plans can determine which addresses may be correctly affiliated but just don't belong in provider directories where patients can go and make an appointment. Another feature we included was we've started asking our providers for each of their locations to outline if they're participating with a particular health plan and if they're accepting new patients for this health plan. Now, this enhancement comes from the state of affairs where the provider could accept certain health plans at a particular location, but not others. And even if they are participating with some health plans, they may not be accepting new patients. So again, we wanted to go one layer deeper when we talk about what information should be presented in a directory for a particular health plan. And for this enhancement, this is really information that's specific to a health plan. So we really do think that health plans can make really good use of this information. Finally, I talked about implementation. All of these features wouldn't add any value if they're not implemented correctly or if they're not utilized correctly with a health plan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the changes we made to our implementation support and the teams we've added to ensure that your team members are looking at this data correctly and they can utilize it at your organizations to get value. All right, let's talk about practice location reconciliation. So, as I mentioned, one of the key features we made when we were addressing this accuracy problem was that we wanted to get the health plans and the providers really talking. And how we did that is we asked health plans, and we have the capability for health plans to send us their provider directory locations. We load them into DirectAssure, and we compare them to the provider's base CAQH ProView profile. If there are any discrepancies, we ask the provider to reconcile them. You can see on the screen, those are what a provider sees. If there are discrepancies, they can either accept the location that's presented to them, or they can reject the location. And if they reject the location, they have to give a reason why they're saying that location is no longer valid. If the provider does decide to accept the location, that information is added to their ProView profile, and the responses to these are provided back to the health plan for processing in their downstream workflows. Our goal here is that we want to get all the bad data out upfront in a quick and efficient manner to really give most health plans a boost in their accuracy. Let's go to the next slide. So while we were testing this process, I have this slide up on the screen to give you guys a sense of the response rate and some of the improvements you can expect. While testing, we partnered with a large health plan, and we had them send us locations for around 3,800 unique providers. Within 4 months, which is about the normal attestation cycle, we were able to get over 85% of those providers back in the system to come respond. And they were responding to locations and basically telling us whether these locations are good or bad. In total, the providers rejected about 22% of the locations, and the health plan was able to terminate those locations and effectively dramatically increase their accuracy. Now, this was a small sample size, so we didn't do this across their market, but what this gave us the confidence that this type of strategy really works well and can be really effective once we productize it. Now that we've released the solution, we have productized this capability, and I want to share with you guys some of the early results we've seen. Next slide, please. So what you guys are seeing here are, for a particular market, the provider responses to locations submitted by the health plan. I'm going to talk you guys through this graph. On the left-hand side, we have a breakdown of locations that a health plan has submitted to us. The exceptions are some of the errors that we catch if the necessary fields that we need to process aren't available, so you can ignore those for now. Usually we require the provider's address, practice location address fields are mandatory, their TINs are mandatory, and some of the identifiers are mandatory for us to find that provider and their information in our system. However, let's focus on the 25% of locations that were already in ProView. Now, what the system was able to do was we were able to identify that for this particular market, and it was a large state, it was a statewide market, DirectAssure was able to identify that 25% of the practice locations for these providers already existed in ProView. So effectively, we didn't bother the provider about those locations. They had already entered those locations in ProView and then answered the necessary questions. It actually gives us even more confidence that the provider entered those locations in ProView and the health plan has those locations, so they're good locations. I want to focus more in on the 67% of locations that were new to ProView. These are locations that providers have not entered in ProView. However, the health plan currently has those in their provider directories. So effectively, patients can make appointments at those locations if they go online and look at their provider directories. When we presented these locations to providers, we found that the overwhelming majority of them were rejected by providers. You can see that's where the 65% number comes from on the right-hand side pie graph. When we analyzed the responses for why all these providers are rejecting most of these health plans locations, the majority of them were because they were addresses which were valid at one point in time, however, they were no longer valid. So they're old addresses that the health plan had failed to terminate on their side. And we know that this is a practice that happens regularly. Most health plans haven't been as proactive in eliminating old addresses when providers move locations. 14% of those addresses were addresses that the providers did accept. So that was information that the provider said, oh yes, I should include this in my ProView profile. It's a valid address. I practice here. Or I'm correctly affiliated with this address. And then there's a 21% of addresses where the provider looked at the address, but they weren't able to give us a clear response. They weren't able to correctly say, yes, I practice here, or no, it's a bad address. In those instances, we do give the providers the option to say, I don't know, and allow them an out so that they can continue to attest with the rest of their CAQH profile. However, for any address the provider marks as I don't know or reviewed, we do present it to them again every time they log back in. So our strategy here is we want to know why they don't know, and if we present it to them over and over again, they would do some research, or a member of their staff will do some additional research to identify if that address is a valid address or if it should be removed. Now, if we look at this in entirety, as I mentioned, this is for one state market for a health plan. We can see that there's a potential of over 35% improvement in provider directory accuracies. And really, those are the targets that we were going after. And you get those efficiencies by aligning the health plan and the provider with the information that both of them have. And that's really the benefit we think we can have with this feature. So significant boost in accuracy. This health plan plans to act on all of these responses, and they're putting in workflows to either terminate or suppress some of these locations where the provider has said that those locations are no longer valid or they're bad addresses. So I mentioned before, we have started asking more detailed questions to elicit more accurate data. Oftentimes, providers, when being asked about a location, they'll be asked, do you practice at this location? And they'll give an answer which they believe to be correct. However, we know that to get to the accuracy of information, especially when we want to put it in patient directories, we need more detail. The provider could be correctly affiliated with the location, but they may not take appointments there, or it's not a location that you would want to present in a provider directory for patients. So we included a new question in our portal. Every time a provider adds a location, or for any of their existing locations, we ask them if they're currently practicing at this location, and if they say yes, we ask them a follow-up question. And we ask them to describe their affiliation with this practice. You can see some of the responses on the screen. What we want to know is the provider seeing patients there regularly or even monthly on some kind of regular basis for a patient to go in and make an appointment with that provider? Or do they fill in for colleagues or read tests or some kind of other affiliation which wouldn't warrant listing that location in a directory? If we go to the next slide, we can see that there's significant improvement that can be made in accuracies if we utilize these responses. 34% of the volume represents responses that should be suppressed in provider directories. So based on our analysis, the two responses that should be published in provider directories are if a provider sees patients there at least once a day or once a month. If they answer anything outside of those two responses, based on the research and audits we've done, that data, those locations should be suppressed. Now, again, those are instances where the provider could cover in or fill in for a colleague, or they might read tests, but they're not really locations that you should be publishing in your directory. So that's an example of another level of detail we've gone to obtain better accuracy for practice locations already in ProView. And these locations can be entered by the provider, or as we mentioned in the previous example, the provider can accept the location that a health plan already has in their location. They would still have to give us this level of detail. All right, let's move to the next slide, where we ask the providers to validate their insurance participation and acceptance of new patients. Every time a provider adds a new practice location in ProView, they have this new section called participation. In this section, you'll see a list of health plans. These are all the health plans that are participating with DirectAssure. We ask the provider to tell us if they're participating with that health plan. And if they are participating, if they answer yes to the leading question, we ask them if they're accepting new patients. Now, the goal of this enhancement is to provide a feedback loop to make sure that when it comes to participation and accepting new patients, so the health plan and the provider are in sync with their contractual obligations and alignments. And what we want to do is we want the health plan to use this data, and if there are any discrepancies, conduct outreach or identify where there's misalignment with contract terms between the provider response and what the health plan expects. We really do think that this is going to alleviate those situations where providers are accepting specific insurances at specific locations, but not at other locations. And again, the responses that health plans get when they see this data is specific to their organization, so they're directly actionable to them. I want to talk about some of the updates we've made to our implementation process. Now, all of this may seem a little daunting, and it is data that is very valuable, but it's only valuable if you have interpreted it correctly and if you're utilizing it correctly. So we have a fairly straightforward implementation process to utilize some of these new benefits. We have a 4-step process, and as most folks on the line are already familiar with DirectAssure or maybe using DirectAssure at their organizations, the first step really involves rostering the providers that you're interested in getting this data from. Most folks on the line may have already done this step, so you're already ahead of the game. The next step involves sending DirectAssure all of your provider locations and any related data that's necessary for practice location reconciliation. This is really important. This is where, again, we think that you can get a significant boost in your directory accuracy by comparing the data that you have with the data that exists in ProView, and again, presenting it to the provider for reconciliation. The third step is after you get the provider responses and other data that the provider has entered, how do you utilize it at your organization? This involves making sure that you have access to the data, making sure you understand the data, but most importantly, making sure that there are processes in place at your organization where this information is being utilized. Our implementation experts work with your teams to identify what those processes are and make sure that the data that you're getting back is something that your business teams and technical teams can sufficiently understand to utilize at your organizations. I would say this is the most critical step, and most organizations that have challenges in maintaining directory accuracy don't do this step really well. So we want to make sure that everyone who participates with DirectAssure can properly utilize this information at their specific organization, given their structures in place for them. Finally, step number 4 is provider education. None of this will be possible without informed providers, and again, making sure that us as an industry and providers are on the same page. So we have a provider engagement manager working with each health plan as they go through this implementation process to make sure that we're sending aligned communication to their providers to update the information in ProView and respond to their practice locations accurately. So far, we've done this with several organizations and we've been quite successful. And we've found that most providers really want CAQH to be the one place where they enter the information and all health plans can go and get it from them. We can move to the next slide. This adds a little bit more detail into the implementation process I was talking about. At a high level, we'll have a kickoff call, and we want the health plans to have the necessary teams in place on their side as we start on this implementation journey. This is where we evaluate the roster population, and we develop a test plan on how a health plan wants to move forward. In the planning phase, we'll submit a roster file if that needs to be submitted, and we'll define and build the data consumption logic that the health plan is thinking, again, to consume that data downstream and build those business rules. And we also have a test environment which we can be leveraged to submit an input file from this is the health plan's data coming to CAQH, and also define the provider communication plan. Finally, when we're ready to go live, we turn these systems on in production. We are able to send communication to providers. We can automate or at least create a process where the health plan can regularly send us their directory data. And we can confirm with the health plan that they can receive the data back and utilize it. And then finally, the last step is fairly important. It's the maintenance and support of this. So what we believe that folks should be looking at this data regularly, and they should continue to improve on the processes that are already in place. Some of our health plans initially are only focusing on locations that they believe to be inaccurate. And they want to leverage this capability to gain a significant boost in their directory accuracy. While that is a really good area to start, there's a lot of additional data in DirectAssure that can be utilized for a lot of downstream capabilities. So we want to encourage all health plans to look at the data, make sure that they have a good understanding of that information, and develop plans at their organization on when they can start to utilize all of the information, all of the rich information that is that the provider is providing through the DirectAssure data extract. I want to end this webinar with some of the key takeaways about the new features and the benefits of those new features that we've developed in DirectAssure over the last couple of months. We talked significantly about DirectAssure location reconciliation and how it can provide an immediate boost to your directory accuracy. We also talked about provider affiliation with each practice location. This is where the provider tells us what their relationship is at each location so that we can identify those affiliations, but only publish locations where they see patients on a regular basis. Number three, providers providing plan-specific responses around their participation with an insurer and whether they're accepting new patients at those locations. This concept is around realigning health plan understanding and provider understanding around contract obligations, and if there are discrepancies, providing a feedback mechanism to resolve them. Finally, we believe that our DirectAssure implementation team and process can really help health plans realize all of these new benefits that we've provided in our latest update. Overall, some of these benefits will include a reduction in inaccurate practice locations, resolving differences between health plan data and information that exists in ProView, identifying those misalignments at the contract level, and really limiting the provider friction from ongoing outreach that plans are continuing to do. And I think that's a really important point. As an industry, if we're going to align towards getting accurate data, we need to create consistent channels where providers can enter that information. Currently, there's a lot of outreach being done to providers via phone, fax, and outreach, and we're providing an alternative to that, which the providers prefer and want to use moving forward. Let's talk about next steps for your health plan. How can you benefit from these features? So any health plan that purchased DirectAssure after November 2017, they're already exposed to some of these features, and they're already working with our implementation team members to get onboarded. Existing DirectAssure health plans and customers who choose to use these features will see a modest price increase in their quarterly invoice for provider outreach. Now, if you're interested in using these features, please do reach out to your account manager on how you can leverage these capabilities, as most likely they will be beneficial to your provider directory accuracy and your provider data strategy. With that, I think that ends our presentation. So we'll take some questions if we have any.
Thank you, Hassan. And everyone, again, as a reminder, please submit your questions in the right-hand section of your GoToWebinar questions section. We've gotten a question about whether or not that we answered at the very beginning, but in fact, yes, we will be sending out a recorded version of this webinar to all of the individuals who are currently listening to the webinar, so you may share it with other people on your team. So one question. What has the provider response been to these new features? Hassan.
Thanks, Karen. So we attend some provider conferences or ProView user conferences where folks who traditionally use ProView are present, and we've presented them this new feature at those conferences, and we really gauge their feedback. For the most part, providers are excited that this is happening. They want their patients to have accurate directories. The issue is that they don't want to be outreached multiple times. So if this is a feature which streamlines providers' ability to enter information once and have all the health plans leverage that information, they're all on board. And really, I think our challenge as an industry is to make sure that we provide consistent avenues for providers to enter that information.
Thank you. What is the implementation timeline for these new features in DirectAssure?
So I can take that one as well, Karen. So I mentioned that we've already onboarded a couple of health plans. It has taken anywhere between 1 to 2 months. However, the implementation timeline depends on a lot of factors on the health plan side. One of the factors that traditionally delay implementations is the health plan getting a team together at their organization that is ready to work with us. So normally we need a project manager, someone who represents the business, a business lead, and one technical person or technical lead to understand how these systems are going to integrate together. We believe, again, the most challenging portion of the implementation is how this data is going to interact with data with existing health plan systems and business processes. So that can take longer depending on how complicated they are and how familiar your teams are with those processes that are in place. And that really will determine how successful the implementation is at your organization.
What resources does CAQH provide our organization to help make sure that, in fact, we are utilizing this information to the fullest extent possible?
So we have a wonderful implementation team, and as you onboard with us, you'll be assigned an implementation manager. And the implementation manager would work with all of your teams, your project manager, your business lead, and technical lead, to make sure that at the very beginning of this project, your teams understand what the solution does and how it's going to benefit you, and really target those areas that you're seeking the greatest improvement. Furthermore, our implementation manager can tell you the best practices that we recommend on leveraging the data that you get back. So a couple of areas we talked about were practice location affiliation responses and those plan-specific responses. And really, our implementation managers can guide organizations on how they can leverage that additional data set to improve the location accuracy in their provider directories, and recommend which information should go to some kind of exception or outreach queue. There are instances where if a provider says, I don't know, or reviewed response to a reconciliation question, a location reconciliation question, we recommend that either the health plan suppress that location if the provider says, I don't know, or they actually, if they have the capacity, conduct outreach, that sliver of population that says that they can answer questions around these locations. So obviously we also help with any technical issues that the health plan is having while onboarding. We want to make sure that at the end of the implementation, the health plan can send us their practice locations. They can get the practice locations back and all the other provider data back. And that information makes sense to them and their organizations to utilize in the downstream processes.
How do we know that the person who is filling out the information in DirectAssure or in ProView knows the accuracy of the location data?
That's a good question, Karen. So I'm going to refer to Hassan for a couple of key statistics around this, but we've shown that through our beta phase, but also through some early results from a handful of health plans, that providers have been able to give responses relative to whether they practice at a location or not. In addition to that, we have done some auditing of the data as well. So this is outbound call, CMS style methodology to audit whether a provider is practicing at a location, and confirming whether the rejection responses are accurate. So could you remind me what the number is again that we discovered?
Sure. So when we did our initial testing phase of practice location reconciliation and presented that to 3,800 providers, we audited those responses, especially the responses where the provider said that they're not practicing at the location or they reject the health plan's the location in the health plan's directory. Around 85% of those responses were accurate. And then one of the things that when we productized this really reconciliation process, we designed the user interface so that the provider has all the options to give us the best response. One of the reasons why the I don't know option exists is because we don't want the providers to give us bad responses when they don't know the information. So either you know the information and you can answer yes or no, or you don't know the information and you tell us that you don't know. And for the most part, based on the user testing we've done, that's what that information is what the provider community has told us is what we can present to you. And for the most part, the provider community does answer correctly when they know the answer.
Okay. Thank you, Hassan. And final question I have is, if we are interested, what are the next steps for our health plan?
So for those of you who have an account manager who's designated and who you have great contact information for, feel free to reach out to your account manager for some more information about these new exciting capabilities around DirectAssure. If you have questions about the implementation process or the checklist, they can connect you with the right people as well. And they'll be able to show you what the next steps are to transitioning to some of these new capabilities. If you're brand new to DirectAssure, please reach out to our sales team, and we're happy to present you the right information as well.
Another question. In the section where you're asking for plan affiliation, is it possible to add a section that refers to either commercial or Medicare Advantage plans?
Thanks, Sharon. I can answer that question. And that is a really good question. We get that from a lot of folks that most health plans don't need the information it's good to have the information at the insurer level, but they really need that information at the product level and really at the network level if it goes down even a layer deeper. That's something we are looking into. It's on our roadmap for 2018. We're putting together a strategy to get that information from health plans and have the provider review that information and confirm it, and again, send it back to the health plans for that realignment. So it's something we're actively looking into. It's on our roadmap for 2018, and we'll roll that out as we get confident in our approach that the providers can interact with the information and do so in an effective manner.
So maybe a couple more words about that. We've actually worked very closely with the provider community on presenting concepts on how to display this information, how to align this information with them. And Hassan mentioned a couple of conferences that we've been to. As we've shown some concepts about how we would display this product category information, this network information to the providers. These are ProView users who are currently using us right now. They were actually pretty excited about adopting that type of capability and responding and reviewing it through ProView. They said that they would use that information a number of ways. They said that they would bring that to their billing department, their contract department, their appointments department. So, I think there's a real appetite from the provider community on utilizing and reviewing this data through the CAQH platform. So we're excited to be working on it and delivering it to them in 2018.
That's a great point, Ron. And to add to that, as we've done our user research, one of the key insights that we've gotten is that for this type of information, when we get to the product level detail or the network level detail, most providers, and I would say the health plans as well, consider the health plan the source of truth for that information. So that's how we've been thinking about solutioning for this problem and really getting the information from the health plan and having the provider review it as a feedback loop. And if there are any information in that the provider believes to be incorrect, they can flag it for the health plan, and that really needs to be resolved through contracting updates or through provider education. So as I mentioned earlier, it's something we're actively looking into, and we hope to have something rolled out in 2018.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Ron. And thanks for everyone who participated in today's webinar. This concludes the webinar. As a reminder, tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar that you can share with your colleagues. And we do encourage you to reach out to your CAQH account managers who can answer any additional questions you might have and who can help get you enrolled in this new functionality for DirectAssure. Thank you for joining today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.